Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this meeting of the Built Heritage Subcommittee. So we have one regret this afternoon, which is Councillor Wilkinson has let us know that she was not able to come to the meeting today. Any declarations of interest? No. I see none. Great. So confirmation of minutes. Can we confirm the minutes of Thursday, September 13th, 2018? Are those carried? Okay. Great. Okay, we have two substantive items and then one item under other business. Today, there are speakers signed up for both items, so we won't proceed through a consent agenda. So our first item is the application to demolish McGee House at 1119 Wellington Street West, a property designated under Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act. And we're going to ask staff to introduce this item.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. As noted, this is an application for demolition of the McGee House at 1119 Wellington Street West. The property is designated under Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act, so any demolition of a designated building requires the approval of Council after consultation with the Built Heritage Subcommittee. That is the reason this is before you today. McGee House is located in Hintonburg. It was designated in 1996 for its architectural and historical value. It was constructed circa 1881 and is a rare stone building in Hintonburg and is a landmark. Whoops, sorry. Just to give you a brief timeline of the events that have occurred on this property, I'm sure everyone is aware of the July 24th partial collapse of the west wall of the building. On July 25th, the City commissioned John Cook and Associates to review the building condition. On July 26th, a report was submitted to the City with recommendations for immediate action. This report noted that there were serious and immediate public safety risks due to the fact that there were little or no mortar remaining in the wall to support it. The recommendations of that report were to remove the upper area of the southern end of the west wall, remove the west section of the flat roof, and remove the masonry at the southwest corner. This work was undertaken through an emergency order on July the 27th, issued by the chief building official. And the work was undertaken under the supervision of John Cook and Associates engineers. Sorry, I'm just going to go back one. This work, I'll show you a photo of the work in a moment, but after the work was completed, there was a second report submitted to the City by John Cook and Associates with recommendations for future action. These recommendations I will discuss in a moment. On September 11th, the property owner submitted an application to demolish. The photos on the screen right now show on the left, you see after the initial collapse, so the west wall of the building partially collapsed, and on the right, you see after the partial demolition based on the emergency order issued by the chief building official. The photo on the right is essentially how the site looks today. It has been fenced off and the sidewalk is closed on that side of the street. So as I mentioned, on July 31st, a follow-up report was provided by John Cook and Associates to look at the condition of the remainder of the building. And the report, this is an excerpt from the report. Rather than provide bullet points, I thought this was appropriate to use. Basically, it says that in order to restore this building, the wall would have to be dismantled stone by stone, cannot be restored in place safely, as changing one stone could result in immediate instability of the wall. And the final conclusion was that the condition of the remaining structure at the original building was deteriorated to the extent that the conservation for the purpose of retention cannot be carried out in a safe manner. So the final piece from this report is that the stability of the structure, while it wasn't an immediate safety risk, the immediate safety risk had been dealt with through the partial demolition, but that the stability was in the short term, and that the building should be demolished no later than late November 2018. Chris Vopney from John Cook and Associates is here today if the committee does have any questions regarding these reports. And in addition to this, in order to sort of peer review the work done by John Cook and Associates, the city has recently contracted Odrovich Engineering out of Toronto to have another look at these reports as well as review the building. And I visited the building with them yesterday. And their preliminary conclusions, they haven't provided us with a written report yet, but I did just hear from them this morning, that they concur with the findings of the Cook report and that the building could not be restored in situ. It would have to be dismantled stone by stone and completely rebuilt. And that there is an upcoming safety risk as a result of the upcoming season change. So that confirms in addition to what we already knew. The recommendation in the report is to approve the application for demolition, subject to two conditions. One is that the applicant enter into a site plan agreement with the City of Ottawa, and this is required by the official plan. The site plan would address landscaping, retention, and reincorporation of some or all of the stone from the building. That amount is to be determined. And commemoration of the history of McGee House through an interpretive panel or a plaque on the site, and other possible commemoration ideas when a new development occurs on this site. The second condition is that demolition must be completed by mid-November to ensure that the building is demolished prior to winter because of the public safety risk. And then finally, as I said, the recommendations are to approve the application to demolish and direct staff to initiate the process to repeal the designation bylaw. And that's a cleanup issue in terms of once the building is gone, then the reasons it was designated are also gone, so there is no reason to keep a bylaw on the property. Happy to answer any questions the committee might have.
Okay, thank you. We're going to go right to public delegations, and then there'll be lots of opportunity for questions. So first on the list is David Jeans from Heritage Ottawa, followed by Linda Hode from the Hindenburg Community Association.
Thank you, Chair. You and the committee have before you our written submission, and you'll see that it's with great regret that we note the staff recommendation which you've just heard. We certainly cannot and aren't contradicting the reports that you have from the two engineers that demolition is necessary, but we regret it because, as was mentioned earlier, this building is a landmark. It's one of a number of designated heritage buildings in Hindenburg, but it really is at the heart of the community, and its position on West Wellington really did give it landmark status. We do, however, understand that this tragic event has brought about important improvements to the city's inspection process, and it's perhaps that we really would like you to concentrate on as much as possible. For example, to follow Councillor Leeper's recommendation that we should be using new tools to better inspect the condition of buildings. I know that this building was occupied, though thought to be vacant, but certainly the problem of inadequate inspection of roofs, the fact that the mortar, the weakness of the mortar wasn't detected much earlier during the 40 years that this building has been designated. So we're recommending that the city should undertake annual inspections of roofs of vacant and boarded up buildings. We think that perhaps the fact that the building was designated and that its condition really required continuing attention may not have been understood by the owner, and that the city has some responsibility in keeping an eye on heritage designated buildings to alert owners about the need to carry out appropriate inspections, particularly buildings of this age and this structure. We also support the idea that the city should introduce financial incentives such as other cities have done with the Heritage Property Tax Relief Program in order to make it possible for owners of such buildings to adequately invest in their maintenance. So we're very reluctantly agreeing with the staff recommendation that the house has to be demolished. It has been said here that some of the stone should be retained. Given the landmark status of the Wellington Street frontage, we would certainly like to see as much as possible, if not all, of that frontage retained. The engineers have said that it can be taken down, and assuming that the facing stone is in good condition, that could be incorporated into a replacement building. once a new development on that site is approved. And certainly we feel that there should be an interpretive panel reminding people of this lost landmark. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for the submission. Any questions, Mr. Jeans? I see none. Thank you for coming out this afternoon. So next on our list is Linda Hode. Good afternoon and welcome.
Good afternoon. Thank you. I'm sorry my submission was a bit late reaching you, so I will quickly mention what I consider some of the important points. This building is particularly important to the Hintonburg Community Association since it was our first request for designation. And it was, of course, the first building that I did research on, so I have a personal attachment to it. And Sally Coots can attest to that because I worked quite closely with her in presenting my research proudly. So it's quite a tragedy. We are in full support of the recommendations of the staff and the councillor concerning retention of some of the stone and commemoration of the building. We accept reluctantly, of course, that the building will have to be demolished. However, we're very concerned that the repeal of the designation bylaw will eliminate the heritage overlay on this property. Obviously, the bylaw has to be repealed, but the heritage overlay, as you know, is part of the zoning that protects heritage properties. And unfortunately, the photos I refer to in my submission, I forgot to pick them up and bring them, so you will have to picture. I don't know, can you put your picture up? It only has. This house is in sort of mid-block between the Iona Mansions on the corner, and to the left of the screen is the Bytown and Nepean Road Company's Tollgate House, and to the right is the pre-1912 A&P building. So it kind of anchors a block of distinctive buildings which reflect, I think, the development of the Hintonburg village and then the Hintonburg area of the city of Ottawa. So we would like to ask you to recommend to Planning Committee or something to that effect, that they would consider tweaking the TM zoning on this property once the heritage overlay disappears to ensure a sympathetic facade or frontage that will allow a development obviously to take place because we don't want to see an empty lot, but that would replicate the massing of that frontage, not necessarily the mansard roof either. A modern interpretation would be good, but something that isn't going straight up 6 stories with a 2-meter setback at the 3rd or 4th story, something that's a little more in tune with the building that's there. I don't know how much power you have with the Planning Committee, but your word might go some distance to ensuring that they do this. So I think that's really, that concludes the remarks I have. It's a sad day.
Okay, any questions for Ms. Hode? Councillor Lieber?
Linda, can I just ask, with respect to the tweak, something in tune with the buildings that's there, are you seeing the facade of whatever is put in place replicates the McGee house, or are you looking for, can you unpack the word sympathy for me a bit?
Yeah, I don't see a replica. Something that maybe uses the stone in a modern design. It's more instead of, as I say, the zoning bylaw allows you to go up, straight up from the sidewalk, as that building does now, but 6 stories with the exception of a tiny setback, whereas that, in the streetscape, if you go as high as that building and step back enough, more than 2 meters. I don't know what enough is. I'm thinking, well, I don't know, 20 feet. How many meters is that? Something that allows the adjoining buildings to take their place in the streetscape and not be totally overpowered by whatever replaces it. As I say, I don't think that we would want to constrain the design in terms of materials. A modern building could fit there, possibly reusing some of the stone. I don't know whether you are familiar with 7 Clarence, the NCC's proposal there, which was adapted somewhat and has used a combination, I think, of original stone and glass, and seems to me to be quite successful. So I think that you could get a reasonable development on that property. It's a large property. The house does not occupy the entire property, and there's a side yard. So I don't see this as constraining a developer's options.
Okay, I'll ask staff about that at the end of delegations. Thank you.
I see no other questions, so thank you very much for coming out this afternoon. So there is an opportunity for questions to staff. Maybe I'll just start, just because I'm sure a lot of us are thinking this. In the bylaw right now, is this property, does it benefit from a heritage overlay?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, it does. But I guess the correction to what Linda just said was that we are recommending the repeal of the bylaw under the Ontario Heritage Act, but not the removal of the heritage overlay through the zoning bylaw. So the zoning bylaw, Section 60, will remain in place.
Okay, thank you. Other questions to staff? Member Quinn? Okay, I see lots, so we'll start with Member Quinn, and then we'll keep going. Okay. Okay.
That's just a point of clarification. That imposes restrictions on the height of the building as well. Is that correct?
The heritage overlay, in the instance where a building is demolished, limits a replacement building to the scale, massing, height of what's there.
I think Councillor Wilkinson was next.
I just wanted to get more information about the site plan. It says site plan is required, and that's a condition. It is impossible now in the city to have one between now and mid-November. It takes a lot longer than that to get a site plan approved. I don't know if it's not approved, or does it have to have one, or is this going to be waived because the condition to demolish it by mid-November is just a month away, and you won't have a site plan.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I have conferred with my development review colleagues who have assured me that they can complete the work that is required for the site plan prior to November 15th. It is it is related only to the landscaping of the site, basically.
So have they submitted the site plan yet, or?
Not yet, but it's, if you see the recommendations for planning committee are that planning committee directs staff to initiate the site plan process, regardless of whether there's an application by the property owner.
Okay, because I think usually a site plan is distributed to, there's a circulation on it with time to respond and all these other kind of things, and even a simple one has that. So as long as the planning committee can make sure that's waived, I think I wouldn't want to have it delayed to get the demolition down when it's in the state that it's in now.
Correct, and if the building becomes unsafe, then an emergency order could be issued for its demolition regardless of site plan.
Yeah, might be an idea in the next doing the official plan to make it a little clearer in there that there can be times when, for urgent conditions, that this could be waived, because I think the city has a tendency to be very strict on all the rules. At least we run into that all the time, and as common sense has to prevail, I think in this case, I think that's what you're doing. So as long as that gets done at planning committee, to be okay.
Okay, thank you for the question, Member Smold.
Thank you. I heard on the radio recently an interview with the owner, and he made a comment that the building was like an elderly person who'd suffered a stroke, and that didn't have much of a prognosis of survival. And after having read the report and visited the building, it seems to me the building didn't have a stroke, it was murdered. And I would say that part of my question is that since this appears to me, reading the evidence in the report, to be a very, very clear case of demolition by neglect, I wonder is there any action the city plans to take against the owner for this? And then I would also say, to Heritage Ottawa's point, I think this is an example. The engineer noted that the only work that had been done on the building was done inappropriately. And I think that a good, strong incentive program would have been helpful in ensuring that work done on the property was done properly, and might have gone a long way to avoiding this. So can you tell me, will there be any action taken as a result of this with the owner? Thank you.
Through you, Mr. Chair, at this point in time, there are no plans to take action against the owner in this instance.
Okay, Vice Chair Podolsky.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As the events of the collapse of the McGee House have rolled out, and I read through the report, and I'd just like to ask staff about the conditions that are to be applied to the application for redevelopment. I noticed there is the absence of a condition that recommends that the development include recognition of the former mass and form and character of the building that has been essentially being demolished by neglect. It's not costly to the city to make the point that the principles that are involved in trying to deter demolition by neglect should make everybody aware that you have an obligation to recognize what has been lost and to incorporate that in the future building. And so I assume that you gave some thought to that condition. And can I ask why it wasn't included? Because I'm going to probably move that we do include it.
Through you, Mr. Chair, we did give some consideration to that and didn't include it specifically for two reasons. The first being that the heritage overlay does regulate that as well through the zoning bylaw, and the second being that we were wary of attempting to design a building in advance of knowing what was being proposed on the site in the future. We are not sure what's going to happen, whether it's going to be a vacant site, whether it'll be sold and developed. So we were wary of trying to design something or restrict good architecture by telling them exactly what it had to look like when we have the heritage overlay to help us with that as well.
Can I just follow up on that? I don't think that we're expecting the city to design the buildings for the property owner or whoever purchases it next, but the city has a record and policies for putting guidelines on properties. And I think that having a site plan condition that requires the future development to incorporate some of the stonework, which is a recommendation that is already made, but to incorporate as Linda Hold was suggesting, the mass, form, and something of the character. We're not talking about replication here, but we're talking about an extraordinary circumstance where through neglect, a landmark building has collapsed. And I think that I would think the public would expect the city to assert that that landmark had some value and should continue to have some value in the future, not in terms of the heritage loss, but in terms of the massing and the streetscape. And I would draw your attention to the discussions that are taking place at UNESCO right now about the whole question of post-trauma reconstruction. I mean, this is a worldwide issue. You have wars, where you have intentional destruction of monuments. And I would suggest that we put a condition in the recommendation to Planning Committee that has the future developer include the principles of reform massing without designing it for them, but they need to take that into account. And I'll work up some wording for this as we progress through the meeting, or if others have a suggestion, if there's support for that.
Well, maybe just to follow up on that point, and a question to staff as well. So if we look at page 6 of the report, under site plan, we have a requirement for site plan control, and then reading the last sentence, the site plan process will also allow the department the ability to work with the property owner regarding retention of some or all of the remaining stone once the building is demolished, commemoration of the history of McGee House through an interpretive panel on the site, and incorporation of salvage stone into a future development on the site. And so that, as a condition in the report, is not necessarily, all of that is not, well, most of it, I would say, is probably incorporated in paragraph 3, so of our recommendations. So I guess the question for you, Mr. Vice Chair, is are you suggesting that additional conditions go to the massing of the replacement development, or do you feel that the conditions in paragraph 3 satisfy the points that you were just raising?
With the risk of seeming too cerebral here, but I'll take the chance anyway, I would say that under paragraph 3, where we have condition B, which is incorporation of salvage stone into a future development, if I might, I would add to that sentence, which says quite simply that into a future development that reflects the UNESCO principles of post-trauma reconstruction, period. And so that would leave some room for staff and others to examine that principle and translate it, if they like, into massing or form or height. I'm working on this on the fly here, not having consulted in advance about the words, but if there's some suggestion that staff have that would make this addition to sentence B a little simpler and not so esoteric, but has to do with the form and massing and height, then I'd be quite content with that as well. But I think that my view would be I would really support an amendment that in this case puts a little more teeth into it and a message to those that are contemplating demolition by neglect on other properties, that the city cares about the landmark that has been there and that will continue to be there in an altered form in the future. I think it's only reasonable.
What I would request of you, Mr. Vice Chair, is I think what we're hearing, if I understand you correctly, you say you're seeking additional teeth in this paragraph. Certainly reference to the UNESCO principles could be a way of doing that. I myself, perhaps I should feel some shame in this, don't know in great detail what the UNESCO principles of post-trauma reconstruction state. So is there a way that we can put that into more, let's say, regular or easily understood language? I, for one, probably do have to acknowledge that while we have the heritage overlay in place, which deals with the issue of mass to a certain extent, I just wouldn't want a situation where we have different instructions in the heritage overlay from this, but I think I understand and support your idea of let's make sure that the future development reflects what was there, and I think you're offering some flexibility in how that's done. So if there's a way that you can come up with words, and UNESCO is a fine organization, but maybe using different words, that might be something. We could ask staff what their view is on that, but is that something you could contemplate?
I would just ask staff to recite what the overlay says in terms of, I believe it's form, height, mass, character. What are they?
Just give me 1 second. I just have to bring it up.
Okay, thanks.
I'll give you the exact language.
Because, Mr. Chair, that might actually make it fit quite well with the heritage overlay, but it's in words in the report to council. And that way, I think that we make the point.
Mr. Chair, if I may, I actually have the paragraph right in front of me. Where a building in an area to which a heritage overlay applies is removed or destroyed, it must be rebuilt with the same character,
and at the same scale, massing, volume, floor area, and in the same location as it existed prior to its removal or destruction. And this is a component of the zoning bylaw.
I think that would satisfy, but I think that the volume and height of the development, if the underlying zoning provides more capacity, I wouldn't have a problem deleting those words from the condition. What we're really looking for, I think, is what Linda Hode was suggesting, and that is that the experience at the streetscape demonstrates the massing form and somewhat of the character that we have enjoyed up until the demolition. So it might be that those words are taken, but being silent on volume and height. Would that be reasonable? Okay.
Can I try something on? What if we said in subparagraph B, incorporation of salvage stone into a future development, comma, that reflects the conditions of the heritage overlay or the requirements of the heritage overlay? We're in the report recommendations, paragraph 3B. That reflects the requirements of the heritage overlay. Does that work?
That would work for me.
Okay.
I think that it's...
Mr. Willis, or legal, would you have any objection to that?
Mr. Chair, I appreciate the intent. I'm just concerned that we have a bylaw provision that is strong and in place that imposes very strict requirements about replacing like with like to the extent allowed under the Planning Act of Ontario. I believe our bylaw pushes the exact edge of what we're allowed to do and ask for. Going beyond that may not be compliant with the Planning Act of Ontario, and we do believe that in prior instances we have successfully used this provision. So I don't disagree with the intent, but I'm cautioning committee that I think our bylaw does represent our powers that we're allowed to do.
Just a point, and that is that I think that the bylaw under the Planning Act is very valuable, and that's why the heritage overlay was introduced. But I think that it would be important to have this committee, with its recommendation to Planning Committee and Council, actually speak of the principles that are in the heritage overlay, so that we're not silent on it as a Built Heritage Subcommittee, that we actually demonstrate that we have an interest in it, and that we want to try to send a message to the public and others that every effort is being made to achieve the goals of the heritage program and to deter things like this in the future. And so, notwithstanding the fact that the bylaw is there, I think this is just a condition added to the report to Planning Committee and Council that would just reinforce it.
Okay, so can you read out what your proposed motion is in terms of additional language?
My proposed motion, and I have to rely on Steve right here to fill in the blanks for me.
Mr. Chair, if that's an invitation to offer some advice, perhaps a direction to staff, which you have much more latitude in your wording of any direction to us as opposed to a motion which directs us to consult those guidelines from UNESCO as we review a development application, might be a helpful way of taking your intent and applying it in tandem with what zoning already tells us we must do. That's advice.
I think we're finding ways and means to achieve the same end, because I think there's a certain amount of unanimity here. And if Steve Willis is suggesting that it be a direction to staff to consult on this, I'm quite happy with that. I'm not sure if it's part of this motion or if it is just a direction. Then if it's a direction to staff, then I think the point will be made.
Okay, can we all agree with that direction to staff?
So directed.
So directed, excellent. Okay, solved. Thank you, Mr. Willis. Member Small.
I just wanted to clarify something. In the report, it talks about the retention of the stone And then later on, under the recommendation number 3, it says conditions related to retention and storage of salvage stone from the building. And then it talks about some or all of the salvage stone being reincorporated. And I'm a bit confused because at the first section, it seems to indicate that all of the stone will be retained and reused. And this recommendation number 3, when you use the term some, does some mean like 2 stones, or does it mean 200 stones or 2,000 stones? Thank you.
Through you, Mr. Chair, this is a very large building with a lot of stone. So the thought is that those details would be sorted out through site plan, but the intention is a substantive amount of stone, not 3 stones.
Councillor Leader.
Thanks, and excuse me. I just want to confirm, maybe with Linda and David, that the applicability of the heritage overlay provisions satisfies the concern that you brought up earlier in your presentation, Linda. Yeah, so we're on in good shape there. My question might be a little more pedestrian. When will this building come down? We've heard from the BIA, we've heard from neighbors about the business loss that's been asserted, the fact that the sidewalk is closed, and there is some keenness on the part of the community to see the building down sooner rather than later.
Through this heritage permit, the owner has until November 15th to demolish the building. As you see in the report, there are concerns about when winter comes, what that means. If winter does come and the building has not been demolished, that would be up to our Building Code Services colleagues to step in and consider whether emergency orders are required to demolish the building.
How fast could an emergency order take place? So if there is foot dragging, we don't want this to go beyond November 15th. When could we make that decision to go in and demolish it through an order?
Mr. Chair, Richard Ash with Building Code Services. I mean, those would be further investigations that we would have the engineers report on as to whether or not the building was affected at that time. But we would be going through the professionals to understand that the building was, if we're going to issue an emergency order, then we would have to have that security that the building was in fact in an imminent state of failure.
Okay, I think the community is looking for some certainty that there is a date by which they can count on this building coming down at this point.
I don't think I can give you, that type of clarity at this point. I mean, that we're working towards that. We would look for voluntary compliance pending the outcome today from the owner, and we'd have to take those measures as we see fit if that's not complied with.
Doesn't provide us with a lot of certainty or comfort, but I understand the position you're in. Thank you very much. It is sad to see that it's gotten to this point. I have to urge, the next city council, as heritage becomes a more active discussion, I hope, in the next term, to take a look at how we can help property owners maintain their buildings. Hindenburg is changing rapidly. This building is a touchstone to our past. It's gone now. I do hope that in the next term of council we can take a look at how to avoid these sort of situations. I understand that the building has to come down. I support the recommendations that staff have made, but let's hope this becomes a more pressing discussion in the next term of council. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, with the additional staff direction, is this item carried? Carried. Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, we'll turn to our second substantive item, which is an application with regard to 227 Mackay Street, a property located in the New Edinburgh Heritage Conservation District. Before the staff offer a brief update on this item, I'm going to ask the Vice Chair to introduce the motion which was circulated, I believe, yesterday on this item.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just like some advice from the Chair, the new motion is pretty lengthy, and so would it be of benefit if I read it all out so that the public understands, or should I get to the specifics of the motion? What would be your advice?
I think you can summarize in whatever way you think is appropriate without reciting the preambular paragraphs, and I think the staff have the intention of explaining why this technical motion is being introduced.
Okay, then I will get to the following changes in the to be made to the staff report. Number one would be to revise the English subject to be application to construct a new building at 227 McKay Street, a property located in the new Edinburgh Heritage Conservation District designated under Part 5 of the Heritage Act. Two would be to revise the French subject to, and I'm going to pass on that because I will mangle the language, sorry about that. Number three, to delete recommendation number one and renumber the remaining recommendations accordingly. And four, to delete the following statement in paragraph 2 on page 4, to delete the statement. And the statement to be deleted is, as there was neither a heritage permit under the Ontario Heritage Act, nor a demolition permit under the Building Code Act to permit the demolition, this report has been prepared because demolition and new construction in the Heritage Conservation Districts designated under Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act require approval of City Council. And 5, delete in its entirety the section of the discussion under subheading Recommendation 1, and I know you're following this very, very closely. On pages 4 and 5, rename the remaining subheadings accordingly, and we will rely on staff to explain what all this is about in plain words. Thanks very much.
Okay, so thank you for introducing the motion. We'll ask staff for a brief summary of this item, and then we've got public delegations who will be speaking to this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Again, this report is in front of you today as an application under the Heritage Act. You've just received information regarding the motion to alter the original report, dropping original recommendation 1. You may choose to support that motion, but I will add clarity that this decision was made after the initial completion of the report, after discussion with our legal services, and it was determined that removing recommendation 1 would provide a clearer report for the consideration of Built Heritage Subcommittee today. So thank you very much for that motion. How come I can't move it? The subject property, 227 McKay Street, is located in the New Edinburgh Heritage Conservation District, facing the Governor-General's grounds between Kiefer and Dufferin Terrace. You may recall that in October 2017, this committee, you considered a report regarding the property. And at the time, Built Heritage Subcommittee made a recommendation supporting staff supported staff's recommendation here, I'll just go to the next page, it's clearer. So the report, which was supported by Built Heritage Subcommittee and went on to receive the support of the City Council, was to retain the small house illustrated here, which was built in the 1890s. The approval was to allow the demolition of the rear wing of the building, then have it moved on to cribbing in the backyard while a new foundation was dug, and then place it back upon the foundation and construct an addition to the rear and a new front veranda. The heritage permit was signed by the mayor on October the 12th, 2017, and the applicant and owners were sent copies of the permit. Subsequent to the heritage permit being issued, the project received variances from the Committee of Adjustment, which were not appealed. Heritage Ottawa supported the original application. New Edinburgh Community Association supported the removal of the building, the new foundation, and the front facade, but had concerns which were aired at this committee regarding the rear additions to the property. Because a building permit for a project is always required in addition to a heritage permit. The owner made that application and it was issued on June 27th, 2018. The permit was to, and I quote, construct an addition and interior alterations to a 2-story detached dwelling. By the end of July, the building was sitting on cribbing, don't have a picture of this, in the rear yard, according to the heritage permit. On August 23rd, by August 23rd, the building had been demolished without permission under the Ontario Heritage Act. In addition to the demolition, construction of a new building was proceeding. Again, this was in contravention of the heritage permit, which had been issued for an addition and the reinstatement of the original house. It is the intent of the city to pursue charges under the Ontario Heritage Act related to the demolition of the building without a permit, without a heritage permit. City staff met with the applicant to discuss the violations to the permit, and the result of that meeting was that the owner agreed to submit a new application under the Ontario Heritage Act to permit the erection of a building in a heritage conservation district. We received this application on September the 12th. In addition, an order to comply was issued that required the owner to obtain a new permit under the Building Code Act, a new permit for the construction of the building, and to revise their previously issued building permit, which was to retain part of the building and add to it. And now it will, the building permit under the Building Code Act will have to be for new construction. So part of that order to comply was also to get heritage permission to allow the project to proceed. And so this report has been prepared in response to that part of the order. In the meantime, the property owner was permitted to ensure that the building would not be damaged by the weather while the orders were being complied with. My colleague from Building Code Services, Richard Ash, can answer questions directly related to the order to comply, which was issued on September the 13th. So, the application in front of you today is to build a structure identical in appearance to the one that Built Heritage Subcommittee, Planning Committee, and City Council supported in 2017, for which a permit was issued. So this, to remind you, because it's been a while, the building in question is the front portion is a 1.5-story gable end to street building with a front veranda. The original doorway of the heritage building will be reflected in the larger window on the front facade, and the principal entry to the new property will be to the side in a new addition. There will be a cross gable roof with a shed dormer built to create additional space upstairs, which is located in where the former additions were to the rear. This is facing New Edinburgh South, and adjacent. And there's this is one of a series of small gable end to street properties, houses. It's a very dark slide. This is the original building, but you can see that there are 4 gable end to street buildings in a row. And so when we were negotiating the original application, which involved the retention of the building, we were very concerned that we would keep this special group of buildings with their shared characteristics of a front gable, side entry, and front verandas. So they were all created at roughly the same time, and many of them were originally occupied by a small German sort of sub-settlement in New Edinburgh that was near the Lutheran church. So the rear of the building, which faces Avon Lane, is much more contemporary in expression. It involves a 1-story addition with a small deck to the rear. Again, there were variances that were required to the heritage overlay, and these were again the variances were approved by the Committee of Adjustment and were not appealed. So again, I briefly alluded to what we look for when we're looking at guidelines for new buildings in heritage conservation districts. These guidelines are in the Heritage Conservation District Plan, which was approved in 2016. And so we support the application for new construction in the Heritage District because the proposed building complies with the guidelines. The building will be of its own time, identifiable as a building constructed in 2018, and its gable-roofed form, its fenestration pattern, and its front veranda accessed by 4 steps, and its siding are consistent with other small frame houses in the area, and also consistent with the guidelines that were approved by City Council when the new Heritage Conservation District Plan was approved. Again, further guidelines speak to cladding materials, height, mass, and materials of the building, windows that may be wood. This has wood windows, natural materials, etc. So, because it does respect these guidelines, the city we're recommending the approval of the building. So, the recommendations are to approve the application for new construction, to delegate authority for minor design changes to the general manager, to issue the heritage permit with a 2-year expiry date from the date of issuance. That's somewhat moot since it's under construction, and to suspend the notice required so that it can proceed from Planning Committee on Tuesday the 9th to City Council on the 10th of October. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. We have a number of public delegations signed up to speak, and then there'll be an opportunity for questions and comments. Sure. Well, do you have, I mean, maybe it's important that everyone understand. Do you need explanation of what the motion is doing? Okay, well, let's wait then and have that discussion afterwards. Okay, so Mr. Jeans, you're first up.
Thank you, Chair. We submitted a short paper on this, though we're very concerned about it, and we are opposed to this application. We said originally to demolish and construct. Now, obviously, the motion is being changed. The application is being changed to only construction. But a couple of things are still not quite clear to us. Ms. Coots stated that the building was apparently successfully moved onto the cribbing in the backyard. So the question that we have relative to the laying of charges for demolition was the demolition deliberate? We certainly feel that there's an important violation here, which is an offense under the Ontario Act as well as under the Building Code Act. We've seen cases before where staff have actually said, last year there was another property, 83 Placelle, where the staff report actually recommended against retroactively granting permission because it would set a bad precedent for designated properties or properties in heritage conservation districts. It appears that we may have a pattern here that some building owners are discovering that the financial benefit of illegally demolishing a building may be significant. You know, the fact that they don't have to do the restoration of the original building. It's cheaper to build new. David Fleming and I have both been in the last couple of days to view this building, and certainly it would appear that plans were underway well before the middle of August or to put a brand new building on that foundation. It's certainly very far advanced already. So we feel it's very important that the city proceed with charges under the Ontario Heritage Act and the Building Code Act so that the penalties will discourage future blatant disregard for the importance of heritage designation and heritage permits being not followed appropriately. The applicant clearly was in the process and had the opportunity to apply for permission to demolish the building if it was in fact in a state that it couldn't be safely restored, and that should have been pursued rather than doing a straight demolition. I'll remind you that this happened some years ago with buildings that were being relocated at Laurier and Waller, developer of the new apartment tower at 50 Laurier had an agreement to relocate a number of buildings. One of them collapsed, and another was then subsequently demolished without a permit. A fine was applied, but even there, it's not clear that the penalty was sufficient to outweigh the financial advantage of just going forward and disregarding the heritage rules here. So we think that you're clearly now moving with a motion to permit new construction, which is different from what we really came prepared to talk to. But certainly the owner should not be rewarded for the action taken here. Thank you.
Thank you for your intervention. Any questions for Mr. Jeans? Seeing none, thank you for coming out this afternoon. So we have two more speakers on this item. The first is Marie Malali. Good afternoon and welcome, and you'll have 5 minutes to speak.
Thank you. I am speaking on behalf of the members of McKay Street. We are a 14-unit condo, a co-op rather, 6 of which units border on the 227 McKay Street property. So in addition to the input that has already been received from 4 of those 6 members, we have the following questions and input to make. So was the original construction, why was the original construction at 227 demolished without the required permit of the city, and why is the city granting approval for reconstruction of an identical house retroactively? And I think that's been queried already. Is it not true that there was a building permit for renovations to the old construct, not for a completely new house? How did the city become aware that the original house was demolished and discarded? Are there building inspectors, engineers, toxicology reports on the contents of the demolished, discarded materials for the old house? And we wish to receive copies of those. As the first approval for the project by the Heritage Committee was done prior to a public meeting, the same thing seems to be happening again. In its October 1st revised letter, Heritage Planning says that the new house is a complete replica of the original building with additions. An email of October 2nd describes the proposed building as identical in appearance to the one in July of 2017. Was there a new architectural plan submitted for replacing the historic part of the home that was destroyed? That is a major question that we have. And the project is no longer a restoration of the historic building. It is a completely new construct. Does this change how the variances that we were given remain, or have there been or will be other changes? And what about the heights of the ceilings within the new construct? We households adjacent to 227 project believe that the frame of the newly constructed building is not a complete replica of the historic house. It is much higher. The peak is more pronounced. The side eaves drawings abutting the units of 21 McKay is not continuous, and our members and residents are asking for the exact dimensions and for the side entrances. We request a copy of the engineer's report on the state of the historic home. We request a copy of the building inspector's report, one that was reported to have been done in the past few days. Were there architectural plans that include the new construction? We are requesting a copy of the revised architect plans for the current structure, including height, side entrances, addition to sides, pitch of roof, and side eaves. Residents and dwellers of 215 McKay, Units 1 to 5, report a huge reduction in the amount of light and airflow into their houses and on their patios, resulting in a diminished enjoyment of their homes, patios, and gardens. And as has been mentioned by two people before, should there not be a recourse, a compensation, a penalty, a repayment, a contribution fee, a fine to the New Edinburgh Conservation District for some other preservation agency or organization for flagrant breaking of rules and decisions that heritage planning and the city have already made for the removal of historic elements of a home that has been destroyed without permission. We would ask that at least $100,000 compensation be paid to the Edinburgh Conservation District for removal of such a historic element of our community. We believe that the new structure will definitely alter the heritage, historic element, and nature of our neighborhood and the streetscapes of McKay Street and Avon Lane. Are there architectural plans for a garage to be in the site and bordering on Avon? What are the dimensions of these? Are there variances to be considered? Height, further cutting off of light to Units 5 and 6 at 215 McKay, and encroaching on a very small space between the two properties. This too would change the streetscape of Avon Lane.
I'm just going to give you a 15-second notice, Madam, for your time.
That's fine. Okay, I'm finished. Thank you.
Okay, great. Let me just explain that a lot of the questions that you raise are going to come up in the discussion. Delegates don't ask formal questions of staff, but I suspect a lot of the issues you raise will be discussed. Good. And furthermore, after the meeting, I'm sure staff will be happy to speak to you about the availability of many of the documents you raised. So thank you very much for coming out this afternoon. A lot of the items you raised will be discussed, and I'll ask staff at the conclusion of this item to speak to you about accessing the documents that are available on the public record. So
will we meet with you immediately after the meeting or sometime later?
I'll ask one of the members of staff to go and speak to you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for coming out.
Thank you for hearing me.
Okay, so the final speaker signed up is John Burrows. Good afternoon and welcome, and you two will have 5 minutes to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to refer to some of the comments of the first speaker opposing the motion, the application for a new building permit for a completely new building, which is being made retroactive to the demolition of the old building in July, and I just want to note that the lot that we're talking about at 227 Mackay is 30 feet wide and extends from McKay Street in the front to Avon Lane at the back. Now, in the drawings submitted by the owner, site plan in 2017, August, September, a minor variance was granted for the heritage building of about 0.48 of a meter, 1 foot 7 inches, based on where the foundation of the original building was compared to the replacement of it. And it was on that basis that the variance was granted. A new building does not qualify for the minor variances. But that seems to be something which, since it was poured, the concrete was poured in June, the old building was demolished in July. Nobody at city planning was told about it until who knows when, maybe August, late August. It seems that there's a very big problem here, a deliberate, flagrant violation. And specifically, the new building, one can measure it, has 9-foot high ceilings on the first floor the original building certainly had no more than 8 foot ceilings and perhaps less. So they went ahead, got all the materials, went ahead and did a build without making any notification to the city. Now, on the same site plan in October 2017, there is a new garage being proposed, 24 feet wide, 23 feet deep, 24 feet high, and this on a 30-foot lot fronting on Avon Lane. And the old garage was a single-story, single-car wooden garage. So there's no justification for any heritage for this very large garage. It is a complete new structure. Now, my question is, have any application been made to the Heritage Planning Committee or the Planning Committee for a minor variance for this building, because it's being shown as being about 23 inches from the west side of the 227 lot, which is the east side of the Avonmore property. And it's a, so it would appear maybe that they're expecting to have some other minor variance for a garage on Avon Lane. Has nothing to do with the heritage house that fronted on McKay Street. And it's indicated to be 0.6 of a meter from the west lot line, which is 23 inches. So less than 2 on the west side of the property line, about 4 feet on the east side of the property line, and in between a 24-foot monster. Has anybody been apprised of this plan that was in the site plan in October of 2017? So given the very lack of trust, the flagrant attempt to violate the original heritage building and demolish it, it seems to me that one needs to look very carefully at what is now being proposed on the rest of the site for a monster garage with only less than 2 foot allowance being made on the west side. When you have 30 feet altogether, you're building 24 feet? Why not? Just get 2 feet here, 3 feet here. Anyway, I know that they are not considering the garage as...
So your time's almost up. I'm just giving you a 15-second warning.
Yeah, I know you're not considering the garage as a specific item on this retroactive recommendation to allow the new build on Mackay Street. But if you trust the guys who are doing it on Mackay Street, you'll find out you have a 32-foot garage on a 30-foot lot.
Okay, thank you very much for coming out this afternoon. Seeing no questions, again, some of the issues that have been raised will come up, I'm certain, in the discussion. So thank you very much for coming out this afternoon. Okay, so this is an opportunity for questions to staff or comments. Member Quinn, start.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to come back to the motion that this is a motion that we as a committee are bringing forward.
The clarification is that the original motion or the original staff report contained an element of a retroactive demolition permission, which upon review, what we heard is the legal department deemed, and it's not dissimilar to how this committee addressed the address on Placelle, if you'll recall, about a year and a half ago or so. Essentially, our focus under the Ontario Heritage Act is on the application for new construction of this building. So we are not retroactively providing permission for the demolition that took place. So what the Vice Chair's motion does, with the approval of legal counsel,
is very much mimicking the Plassal model, is only dealing with the new addition.
So without a permit to demolish, the owner, we are being asked to overlook that and just address the application for new construction, which has, from my understanding, already begun without a permit.
I don't know if
Is that correct? Am I
Mr.
interpreting
Curry
that
or
correctly?
if bylaw or property standards wants to take on that question.
Sorry, I can answer that, Mr. Chair. There is a permit for the construction, but when we became aware of the fact that they were deviating from the documents that form part of the permit, that's when the order to comply was written in September, and getting them to revise their permit to be in compliance. And that's why we're here today.
But it's impossible for them to comply when the building is gone.
That's correct. That's why the recommendation that is before you now from the Heritage Committee, because when we became aware of the fact that the cribbed building was removed, then they could not comply anymore.
Do you know where it is? Is it in a landfill site somewhere?
Mr. Chair, of course, we must remember there are two permits involved. One is the building permit and one is the heritage permit. And Member Quinn, you are quite correct. There was no permit issued for the demolition of the building. It was demolished without permission. That is correct. And so you are being asked to approve a recommendation under the Heritage Act for new construction.
Thank you. In the past, an example came up today about the incident that occurred on what we know as the Nicholas Waller Triangle. In that instance, did the equivalent to this subcommittee, which existed at the time, LACAC, was a recommendation to approve the demolition after the fact brought forward to LACAC?
Mr. Chair, that is somewhat apples to oranges, not apples to apples, because those buildings weren't designated under the Ontario Heritage Act, plus the Ontario Heritage Act at the time was the pre-2005 Act. True. And in addition, I cannot remember all the details because it was well over 15 years ago. So, but of course, Mr. Chair, if there is an interest in getting that information, I would be happy to supply it to whomever.
I'm just wondering about just over time, and elsewhere in Ontario, is this a common practice when something like this happens? What's the due process normally? Is it to obtain a permission to demolish after the fact?
Mr. Chair, I'm not aware of what other municipalities do in this instance.
Any help?
But legal can address that.
Mr. Chair, these situations have to be addressed on a case-by-case basis, and that is what has been done in this situation. The motion, as I understand it, reflects the present situation on the site, which is that the heritage, or the building that was within the Heritage Conservation District is now gone. And so what this committee is being asked to do is to approve the new construction on the site in accordance with the recommendations of.
Okay, thank you for not answering my question. So for the moment, that's all I have to ask. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Lester?
I think help the Built Heritage Subcommittee to provide its recommendation on this report if we did have a kind of public explanation by staff, planning staff, heritage staff, on the events actually that led to the demolition of the building that was stored in the rear yard. Some may have heard through background briefings, but I think that it's important to know what the facts are about whether or not this was an accident or is there evidence for willfulness? I think that we should hear that from you so that it'll help us in our recommendation.
Mr. Chair, to the best of our knowledge, the permit was, the permit was issued end of June. There's a photograph on July the 30th of the subject property sitting upon the cribbing, as was approved by this committee in October, by this committee in October 2017. By the third week of August, that building was no longer there. There was no attempt to contact heritage staff or to discuss the demolition of the building. It was done without our knowledge. It was first brought to our attention, to heritage staff's attention, by the New Edinburgh Community Association on August the 23rd. That was the first that we learned that the building was no longer there.
Mr. Chair, just a follow-up question. We appreciate that the building was there on a particular date, sitting on a crib, and then when the New Edinburgh Community Association reported that it was gone, it was gone. But the cause of its removal, were the police called to investigate whether or not it was stolen? Was there an investigation undertaken to find out if the owner demolished it? This will help the conversation if we need that.
Mr. Chair, it was demolished by the owner, who determined, who hired an engineer on their own, and we have the report, and the engineer addressed some aspects of the building, and that report was on July the 17th. I have it here. I'll just double check the date again, and then it was, and then the building was gone. So we were not informed that the owner, that what was wrong with it. We were supplied with the engineer's report called a field review report after the removal of the property. So it was retroactively supplied to us. And it explained some of the problems inherent to the building, the spacing of the studs, etc., which made them think that they ought to remove it. It's not possible to incorporate it into their plans, and they then went ahead to build, to construct a building that looked the same without this at its core. But I cannot speak for the exact motives and the day-to-day working of the applicant, the property owner at the time. But I can tell you what the information I've been supplied with, and I have told you the information I've been supplied with. But any further questions, happy to continue to answer.
Thank you very much. That does put on the table the concession, which I gather has been conveyed to the city staff from the owner, that he or they or she did demolish the building. If that's the case, and I guess we assume that's the case, by the way, this is a very sad story, as was the McGee House on the same agenda. This is not an inspiring day for heritage in Ottawa. But if the Built Heritage Committee recommends to Council the approval of this building, this new construction, it seems to me that we are rewarding the applicant with an application for a heritage permit for new construction, some of which has been pointed out by some of the neighbors, is dimensioned that for certain purposes that related to the historic building, which no longer apply. And so I have a question to legal staff here. Should this committee refuse this application, and planning committee and council refuse the application, what recourse does the applicant have against the city for refusing an application?
Mr. Chair, there are a couple of things in there. First, this committee is being asked to approve the application in front of it
on the grounds of the information that's contained in the application, separate and apart from any alleged or potential allegation of breaching of the Heritage Act, which is being investigated. And any approval by this committee, planning committee, and ultimately council of a permit on this application is not to be deemed to be a retroactive approval. It's also not deemed to be able to contradict any legal action that the city may take in the future against this owner. Under the Ontario Heritage Act, those penalties are laid out within the Act, but this should be viewed separately. In respect of your question about what happens if the application is refused, then the owner of the property has the right to go to the tribunal, the LPAT, and appeal such decision. So, but there are two separate legal mechanisms here. First, any potential breach under the Ontario Heritage Act, separate and apart from the refusal to grant the application.
Thank you very much. I understand.
Okay, if no other questions from members, I may just pick up on a couple of the questions that members of the public had. Do staff have any information with regard to whether the building in its state now is consistent in terms of setbacks and the variances provided by the Committee of Adjustment? So in other words, is the structure as it exists now consistent, as far as staff understand, with the as approved by you, recommended by you, by council, and whatever variances were granted by the Committee of Adjustment?
Mr. Chair, the building rests upon a foundation which was built according to plan, and the location of the foundation was part of the variances that were approved by Committee of Adjustment. But of course, through plans examination, there could always be further variances, but it is our understanding now that the building in location is consistent with the variances that were granted, because they were by the Committee of Adjustment. Again, perhaps legal can help me out if it turns out that they're not, but it is my understanding that the building permit was issued for the building, and it is, again, in the same spot, et cetera, And also, Mr. Chair, there have been questions about whether it is higher or whatever than the plans, and we did send out a building inspector to measure it, and it reflects the plans as approved under the Building Code Act.
Okay, thank you. Okay, question from Councillor Wilkinson.
What I'm having a hard time coming to grips with, they got a building permit to do something, and they're doing something different. I think that building permit should, in fact, be invalid. I know in court cases written when people went ahead and did something that was not quite correct, and they actually would then get the permit canceled, and if they keep on going, they can go to court, and in some cases the courts have made them take it down again. So I'm just, has the permit been amended to be the different one, or how can it still be going forward? Even if we agree with it.
Mr. Chair, yes. So the building permit, like I said, when we became aware that they were deviating from the approved documents, an order was written. That order states that they are to make the necessary changes to come into compliance. Now, how and what form that takes, that will be the will of this committee and council ultimately. So the owner has not made any revisions yet to their building permit, and they're awaiting the outcome here, in which case that direction, and they will then look to comply with the will of the committee and council.
I'm sorry, but surely the revision that they have made is the demolition of the building.
Yeah, the same thing I'm going on. Is there not some sort of charges or something for making the change without notifying you, without getting approvals? I understand they didn't even get a permit from anybody for the demolition. Is that true?
Mr. Chair, the investigation into any allegation under the Ontario Heritage Act is ongoing.
I realize that, but if we then say they can go ahead and build what they've got now, then, you know, after the fact is too late. There should be a hold on it until we finish the investigation and get the final determination of everything.
So I can answer that.
Continuing to build.
Sorry, can I ask, I was under the impression that there was a stop work order. Can you confirm that, please?
No, there's not a stop work order on the construction. There is an order to comply, which is our consistent sort of progressive approach. We look to put that first order to comply on, and we're in the process, and the owner is in the process of complying with that order. So that we would not see any intent or need at this point to take further progressive action. Obviously, if they look to not follow through, you know, what the outcome of today and going forward, then we could look at progressive action with regards to a stop work order. The owner at the time was asked for, and we looked at the situation, and we felt that they needed to protect their investment that they have currently in the ground. Framing had begun when we became aware of the situation, so they've been given the latitude to weather tight their building at their risk, and that's pending the outcome of today.
How can they make it meet the building permit since the building was supposed to be in there gone? I mean, it's not possible.
No, sorry. So, Mr. Obey, any other comments?
So we realize that the building permit is going to have to change. The wording and the scope of the building permit is going to have to change. But again, how that changes will be based on the outcome of today and of council.
Well, is it outcome of the investigation? Because I think the investigation needs to be finished before there is any adjustments. I may have it in the end, but I think otherwise we might as well not bother doing an investigation.
Mr. Chair, these should be looked at as two separate processes under the Act. One is the adjudication of the application in front of us today, and the second is the investigation that may result in charges under the Act. Do not preclude each other.
Okay, so just to summarize, what Mr. Obey said is that there is an order to comply, and from what I understand is, although there is weatherproofing taking place, since they can't comply right now because the building, they have no approval, there is no further construction work except for weatherproofing taking place. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, I think that's helpful. Thank you. So any other comments or questions? I mean, I think if not, it's important here, and legal counsel has advised us on this, and it's very similar to what we did on Placel, if members recall, that we have before us, we are asked under the Ontario Heritage Act to decide whether the application before us is consistent with the Ontario Heritage Act. Staff have evaluated and have said, yes, the proposed plans are consistent with the Ontario Heritage Act. Separately, what I'm sensing is some frustration that this looks to reward potential violations of the Ontario Heritage Act through the demolition that took place. And what we've been told is legal counsel is undertaking an investigation which could lead to charges in Ontario Superior Court where the applicant could potentially see themselves being charged subject to the legal investigation. I would remind members that in the Placel case, charges were laid and a conviction was found and a monetary fine was assigned. If members separately with discussion or would like to encourage a letter to the province suggesting that such fines be increased, that the range of those fines be increased, that's an important policy discussion, and I'm certainly open to having that, but that's not what's before us now. So although it's difficult, and I can understand the frustration of members in terms of the events that took place, we really do have to limit decision considerations right now to whether the proposed new plans are consistent with the Ontario Heritage Act and the New Edinburgh Heritage Conservation District Plan. So again, it's very similar to the Placel case. It's difficult, but I would encourage members to try and keep those
two issues separate in their minds. This is not a reward for bad behavior. This is a consideration of an application which was done subject to the Act. Political representatives, we have no say in the legal investigation which is taking place through the offices of our legal counsel and bylaw and property and building code services, etc. So again, very similar, Placel. In that case, we're dealing with very similar circumstances. I hope that's a helpful comment because I can sense some frustration on this issue from members. So any other questions or comments?
You've framed it very well, and I think that one of the dilemmas of the way in which you have defined the Built Heritage Committee's task is regrettably narrower than I think what the Heritage Program in Ottawa is trying to achieve by many different means. And I think that what we have in front of us in today's agenda, of course, the McGee House, which is an example of demolition by neglect, and now 227 McKay. And we also have had, and maybe having a briefing on Somerset House shortly, I understand. Another number of other cases that have been referred to, such as 160, 162 Laurier, where Lapine, the developer, inadvertently sort of demolished a couple of houses and was punished by that. We have NCC that allowed 7 Clarence to deteriorate until it had to be demolished, as well as a portion of the facades on Spark Street, which is now the Ashcroft development. We have, I think, an obligation to really demonstrate to the public that the city's heritage initiative, its policies and actions under the Heritage Act really make effort to not just reward people that conserve buildings that are designated under Part 4 or Part 5 of the Act, but to do everything we can to deter others from contemplating that demolition by either neglect or willfulness is something that they can pay the price for but benefit from as well. And I look towards other files that we're going to have in front of us, such as the Medical Arts Building, which is going to attempt to conserve its facades in situ while a new building is being built. There is also the possibility that the Sisters of Visitation convent, which council approved demolishing a portion of it. We still don't know whether or not that will be facing this committee again with a proposal that it can't be maintained because it has been damaged through weather or whatever. And also we've had examples of the Ugandan High Commission where City Council approved the demolition of a building in the Heritage District which had been neglected by the Ugandan High Commission. And of course we now have the Egyptian Embassy that has just vacated its presence in the last week and have 2 buildings on Laurier Avenue that are vacant. So I think that there's a couple of years ago when the mayor instituted the mayor's task force on heritage conservation, it was in response to a couple of files, but instead of diminishing, they seem to be multiplying. And this is, I think, of some reasonable concern. And so I don't feel that should narrowly, apply our task to whether or not the bill here for a new building on 227 McKay specifically meets the criteria of the Heritage Act. And I'd just like to say that I'm going to be somewhat daring here, and I'm going to vote to refuse this application, because I think that there's an important message that has to be sent to the public. Apart from the prosecution under the Heritage Act, I understand the difference between the two, but I think that it's important to convey the message that you just can't benefit through willful acts and consequently, I feel obliged to vote to this application, Mr. Chair.
Okay, so first, on the Vice Chair's initial motion, amending the staff report, is that motion carried? Carried. And then on the amended report and recommendations, is that item carried with a dissent from the Vice Chair? And a dissent from Member Quinn. Okay, thank you. All right, thank you very much. If you'd like to take the opportunity to speak, you've registered your dissent, but please.
Just to say that I support what my fellow citizen member on just said, and to make the point that by removing the staff recommendation to approve demolition through the motion has effectively removed from this committee our right to address the violation that took place. And I deeply regret it because I think it undermines what the City of Ottawa is trying to achieve with heritage conservation through this committee and other due processes to benefit our communities in the city. It doesn't sit well at all, and I'm very disappointed that that is the approach that the city legal department chose to take in regard to this application. So I will not be supporting it either. Thank you.
Okay, so voted. The dissent has been registered. I'm happy to register a dissent on the technical motion. I do, with respect, have to make sure that I'm clear with you that the reason why the amended motion was tabled was actually the exact opposite of the suggestion that you made, Member Quinn. It was to ensure that legal counsel is unfettered in its investigation, and the fear was that the original staff report could have provided or could have been interpreted to have been interpreted as retroactive council approval of the demolition. So we can have that discussion offline, but I want to, on the public record, it actually had the exact opposite intention. So with that, and apologies for missing your signal, the vote has been registered, and now we will move on to our final item on the agenda, which is a staff update under other business on Somerset House. Yeah, and we're going to ask the Vice Chair just to introduce a motion on this item.
Thank you. Just like to that the Built Heritage Subcommittee suspend the rules of procedure to receive an oral update from staff with respect to the Somerset House, and to dispense with the requirement for staff to provide a separate written report on this update, so that the committee may receive a prompt update on the status of Somerset House redevelopment. And I'm assuming this is now good news for today.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Thank you, Chair. So I can advise that yesterday 2 orders were issued by our colleagues in bylaw services. This took a little bit longer than we had anticipated with the events, unfortunate events of the last week. Obviously, our building code and bylaw resources were focused elsewhere. So the 2 orders have been grouped into 2 areas. The first is with respect to the securing the building and weatherproofing the existing structure. And that has a completion correction deadline of this December. So we want to make sure that what is left of Somerset House is perfectly intact before the onset of the winter months. The second order is with respect to the heritage attributes. So ensuring that the heritage attributes on the existing structure are repaired, restored to staff's satisfaction. So in this case, we're going to be ensuring that that's done by April 2019. That may sound like a very long time from now, but as you can appreciate, a lot of heritage attributes require fine grain of craftsmanship in terms of the restoration, so we want to make sure that this is done properly. So this will be done under the supervision of city staff and a heritage conservation architect, and so that has an extension into the spring. Some of that work may have to be done in the good weather, so again, that's why there's a little bit more time on that order. So those two orders have been issued. There's, of course, the right of appeal by the owner to these two orders. Should they do that, then it would be before the tribunal, and my understanding is that is a fairly expedient process. Should they not appeal, then we would expect the work to be completed by those two deadlines I spoke of. Should the work not be done by the two timelines I spoke of, then we would undertake to do the work ourselves and appropriately bill back the cost of doing this work to the property owner. So that was my update today, Chair. I'm happy to answer any questions that you or committee members may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed, I see Councillor McKenney has a question.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And I just a couple of questions. So my understanding here is that these two orders overlap somewhat because we've got the proofing on one where we're securing the building and weatherproofing, but we've got heritage attributes also that have to make it through the winter. And so what does that mean for anything not started until spring? I mean, they have to be completed by April 2019, but if it's not, if the heritage attributes are not removed, some I assume can be repaired in situ, but some will have to be removed. How are we going to ensure those attributes, those heritage attributes, are weatherproofed through the winter?
So we'll be looking at each of the attributes that we've identified, and with the filter of will they do through the winter, Councillor, and making that determination on a case-by-case basis based on the attribute, whether it needs to be or how urgent it is to repair to ensure that it doesn't deteriorate any further through the winter.
So the appeal deadline for the securing and weatherproofing is October 26th and November 1st for the heritage attributes. So will that happen immediately after these appeal dates? What is the time frame?
Well, we're hopeful that the owner won't appeal and will undertake these works, of course, within those timelines. Should they not, should they, understanding is that typically that is a 60-day process in terms of the tribunal process when an appeal is undertaken. So knowing that that the winter is coming shortly, we'll have to take that into consideration and look to ensure that that work is done winter. I also want to remind committee that we have the ongoing requirement to have monthly building code reports filed on the condition of the building. So we will continue to have those as well to ensure on the whole that the building is continuing to be in a good state of repair, or not a good state of repair, that it's rather safe and secure.
So the notice of violation for the heritage attributes, the deadline is April 2019. That's for completion?
Correct.
At what point do we decide, this, if they started to do the work April 1st and the correction deadline is April 30th, at what point do we decide to step in?
What did you say?
I guess what I'm worried about, be a bit more blunt, is a lot of foot dragging. So, you get one little thing done, it's April 27th, don't worry, I'm going to do something else. This is what's been happening at Somerset House, and I think that the city is tired of it. I know I am. So I want to know, what happens at what point do we step in and do the work? If it's not complete April 30th, no matter what, do we step in and do the work?
Councillor, through the chair, I believe we should see what the owner does or does not do during the appeal period. I think that will dictate how they're going to proceed with this. But rest assured, we will ensure that this work is done by April 30th, 2019, whether it's done by them or by the City of Ottawa.
Do you just have an idea of how long the notice for the heritage attributes would take? Let's say they decided today, you know what, I'm going to do this. What would be a time frame?
Mr. Chair, some of them are very complicated, and we have analysis, like the work that might be required. The cornice is all metal, the window frames are metal. To take those off, get them to the appropriate people, we don't have that information. We can get it for you, but we don't have a time frame for that kind of very high-level restoration.
Well, I think that, we'll see what happens through the appeal time frame. But if it looks like we are going into the winter and we are going to see further deterioration, which we have, I think that I would like to have that brought back to built in the next council. I think that we need to be quite clear on what exactly needs to be done, how long it will take, and how we're going to ensure that the deadline is met. So
we're happy to do that, Councillor, and I just want to add that it's also with the quality of the work, which is why we're ensuring that this is done not just by anyone, but this is done under the supervision of qualified professionals as well.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Would it be useful, Councillor McKinney, just to follow up on your suggestion to ask staff to provide another verbal update at the next meeting, which will be after the expiry of the appeal period? So it might be useful both to get an update on what happened with the appeal and an answer to some of your questions about the heritage attributes. Does that work?
Yes, it does, Chair.
Okay, great. So any other questions on this item? Seeing none, thank you very much for the update. So we have to carry the motion introduced by the Vice Chair at the beginning of this item. Is that item carried? Great, thank you. Okay, returning to the agenda. Any inquiries, any notices of motion? Then we are adjourned, and our next meeting is Thursday, November 8th at our regular time of 9:30. So thank you very much.